Welcome to Politically Basic. I'm your host, Kyle Campbell. As we always do, we're breaking down the basics of all political issues and current political events so that you get to decide. We've had a year, haven't we? Foreign wars, ICE arrests and protests, crime and disruption, shootings, the assassination of a prominent political figure, threats against a sitting president. Are we safe? And how safe? Well, let's break down the basics of Homeland Security and the Secret Service today with my guest, the amazing Tim Miller, the founder and president of LionHeart International Services Group. Tim's a 30-year law enforcement and military professional. As a Secret Service special agent assigned to the Washington field office, Tim coordinated all aspects of security for the president, vice president, and foreign heads of state on a regular basis. His extensive background includes leadership roles in Homeland Security, law enforcement, and the Marine Corps. Tim, welcome, and thank you so much for coming on the show today.
It's great to be with you, Kyle. I'm honored to be here, and thanks for what you're doing and bringing the truth to this generation. It's needed.
Well, thank you, sir. I know you're doing the same, and we've gotten to be on Washington Watch together at the same time, and I just really appreciate not just your whole service, but that you are speaking openly about it now. There's a lot of mistruth and misinformation circulating around there, so I'm really looking forward to our conversation today and just hearing from you. You're so well-versed on these issues. Now, Tim, you came up through military service, but how did you end up in the Homeland Security and protecting presidents and heads of state space and arena?
Well, as you can imagine, Kyle, it was a journey. Like any young person, I didn't know what I wanted to do out of college. I knew I wanted to serve my country. And let me be clear, my dad was a World War II veteran, and he always inspired us with, hey, what are you going to do after you've served your country? So going into the military was kind of something that my father expected, but now I look back in all of his wisdom and see, for a young person to serve the country is probably the most important or one of the most important first steps you can do. And so I spent about 7 years on active duty in the Marine Corps, went to college, came out as an officer, and then I spent the rest in the reserves. And part of my duties as a Marine was deploying with Marines worldwide and providing security. And so when I came off active duty, I stepped in. I was a police officer outside of Fairfax County, Virginia, right outside of D.C. And then I had an opportunity to become an agent with the Secret Service. And it was one of those things, Kyle, where you really pinch yourself, the first few times. Wait a minute, that's the president and he's not on TV. But with that came a huge responsibility. And so spent almost 5.5 years in the Washington field office before I transitioned to Homeland Security after 9/11 and worked with the FBI chasing terrorists. And then I ended up in training, which led to what we're doing now, which is helping the American people understand how to protect themselves and how to prepare, because you're right, these are very interesting times, unlike any I've seen in my lifetime.
Mm-hmm. It is. And Tim, the Secret Service has really kind of gone through another level of scrutiny lately as well. And we'll get to that. But gosh, you've just had such a fascinating history and career. What was it like being a Secret Service agent? I mean, you get access that nobody else gets to a president, to a vice president, and remind our audience which president you were protecting. And I would love to just hear from you some of your most interesting moments from that time.
Yeah, so the Secret Service, everybody has this impression that, it's nonstop action, saving the life of the president. It's nonstop boredom for most of what you do. Now, those are interrupted by sheer terror. And, as we saw in Butler, the Secret Service has had some real clear missteps. But to your point, the Secret Service for me was a calling. It wasn't a job. I didn't care which president party, was in office. I just knew when I woke up every day that I had a huge role to play in being willing to lay your life down to protect the leader of the free world. And when I came in, there was exceptionally high standards. I had been a Marine Corps officer, I'd been a police officer, and they're like, yeah, you're kind of the guy we want. We'll train you for the rest of it. But, unfortunately now those standards have slipped and they're hiring Starbucks baristas. I think they're righting that ship again. But let me be clear, and not political at all. You should have the baddest warriors on the planet protecting the leader of the free world. And anything that interferes with having the most qualified, most experienced people around the president, around our leaders, you got to really push back against that. And I think Sean Curran, the current director, is really doing a good job. As you know, Kyle, I was, kind of pulled into the media after Butler and asked a ton of questions, what went wrong? And I think the fundamental thing that went wrong, and we can talk about this later, but when you lower the standards, your performance on game day is deeply affected. And I think they're righting that ship, but yeah.
Well, let's talk about it now. This is what people want to know. We want to feel safe. And after what's happened, particularly to President Trump, and then, of course, to civilians like Charlie Kirk recently, I don't think American citizens are feeling nearly as safe and protected just in general as we had previously. We've always sort of looked to the Secret Service as that most elite protective force. And what we saw during the Butler assassination attempt, I think it just rattled us. It shook us, right? And of course, the media does their job. They're going to pick it apart and say, well, was this person planted, or was this person purposefully not protecting President Trump because of a political ideology that maybe differed from his kind of MAGA conservatism? Can you just sort of break down and debunk some of these rumors around what happened there? Were those Secret Service agents trained properly? Were they doing the best job they could possibly do during that time? What's your expert take on what went down that day?
Yeah, so let me be clear. The problem that we saw in Butler was a shift from the mission, which is sacred, to the people. Well, we only want these kinds of people. And regardless of how you feel about certain, folks being represented, which I'm all about having the right representation as long as you have the right skill set. And so what we saw in Butler, unfortunately, as a Marine officer, as a police officer, I had to make life or death decisions way before I was standing next to the president. And pretty much everybody in that generation that was hired had to have demonstrated performance under crisis situations to even make it in the door. And I think what we saw happen in Butler was about a 5 to 10 year shift in, hey, we're more concerned with who comes in the door than we are the sacred mission. And we've seen it across other government agencies with DOD. And here, let me tell your audience why that's dangerous. At the end of the day, we need our elected leaders doing what we elected them to do. In the military, we need the biggest, baddest war fighters possible that can go and step into harm's way and protect us in our way of life. So I think what happened is, and we saw it played out, you had a bunch, or not a bunch, there were several extremely experienced agents on that day that did a phenomenal job. Unfortunately, the folks that were tasked with perhaps the most important piece, which is doing the advance work, Kyle. I've done hundreds of advances, and the advance process is designed to identify threats way before the protectee gets there and to mitigate those threats. And guess what? The first thing we look for is the high ground. We figured out in 1963, a madman with a rifle can kill a president. And so whatever happened, and it was a systemic failure across every aspect of the advance, that caused the results that you saw. And so unfortunately, the Secret Service had to deal head on with a total failure in their mission and then respond accordingly. And let me tell you, that's not a place the Secret Service ever wants to be.
Well, it's an interesting time talking about, this uptick in incidents having to do with a sniper. It's really, Tim, isn't it just the coward's way, that you would get to a place where you're no longer able to have conversations or accept any information that would temper your, extreme emotions, that would lead you to want to take someone's life and then to do it in a way that essentially puts them in a position of being a sitting duck. And so we saw that in Butler. Of course, shouldn't there have been a Secret Service agent on top of that building where the shooter was? Or and now it's translated down to just, everyday people who are working to influence the political space and change hearts and minds. Do you think, you said that, that was a failure of the Secret Service on that day, last July in Butler, Pennsylvania. They should have either swept the roofs, right? Is this, am I on the right track? Swept them or had someone positioned up there to take a look. Why do you think that didn't happen?
Well, that's the $64 million question, and the investigation is still ongoing. What we do know is that the appropriate resources requested were not provided. You had folks and it's not slamming other federal agencies, but the Homeland Security agents that were there largely executing the security within the crowd and some of those other areas had never had one day of protection training. And so then you get to, hey, the tactical teams never met, never connected before the event. And I got to tell you, Kyle, those are things where I couldn't believe it when the facts started coming out because it was so basic. This is not, hey, how to run a complex play on the field. This is how do you have linemen block and quarterbacks take the snap. And so I think what we saw on that day was a compromise on who should be in those roles and then how are they trained to do those roles. And those systemic failures, I don't know Sean Kern personally. I know folks that know him very well, and they're speaking very highly of how he's turning the ship around, going back to only hiring, those that are very qualified. But let me be clear. That should have caused fear in every American, because if the Secret Service can't do their mission, who else in the government's not doing their mission? And that should cause us concern. And then unfortunately we saw it again with Charlie Kirk. But let me say this, Kyle, I think it's really important. A lot of folks are trying to frame this as, Democrat versus Republican. This is good versus evil. This is pure, you can say what you want about how you feel about the other side. When you advocate people to get a rifle, and unfortunately we're seeing it time and time and time again, the rhetoric, and that should concern us all because we knew in the Secret Service, if an event happened like what happened in Butler, it was going to spur 1,000 or 2,000 others who would want to, step in line and try to do the same thing. Now, what did we see? Saw the same thing happen in Palm Beach County, not much longer later, following that. And then, Kyle, think about it. 2 weeks ago, we saw a tree stand set up, and I live in Palm Beach County. I went to that site, and let me tell you, thank God that the Secret Service had expanded their perimeters. They had done due diligence in identifying that, because that would have been a catastrophe again. And all Americans should say, hey, what does it take for our leaders to be safe and for us to be safe when we go into public?
It's absolutely the right question. That tree stand showing up really signaled to us, didn't it, that these threats are not over. We are still going to have to be extra vigilant, especially when it comes to President Trump, about making sure that he is safe and he's protected. But I think a good sign, too, for us is that, the Charlie Kirk funeral that happened in Arizona about a month or two ago was the largest publicly held and publicly attended funeral in modern history. And you had the president, a vice president, members of the Trump family, and it seemed that everything went off without a hitch. So it does appear that, Secret Service under Sean Curran's leadership has really stepped up their game and that they're being very cautious. I'm very glad to hear from you that, they are expanding perimeters, because we just can't live like this, right? We can't live looking over our shoulder, looking at rooftops anytime someone goes somewhere. And, I've got to tell you, just recently I was with a member of the Trump family. It was not the president, but he has Secret Service protection. So I got this one-on-one, up close and personal experience of how they secured the area that we were in. We were in a hotel for an event, and then I got some very small group, about a group of 5 of us meeting with him, one of the president's sons. And I was really impressed at how smoothly it went. Other people were trying to get in the room and they, there's no amount of, sweet talking or trying to slip through. And it was very well executed. And that gave me great confidence too, that things are going in a good direction with the Secret Service. But, it does not mean that the problem is solved on the other end of it, which is people who have been riled up, who are not mentally sound, who are still going to try to come and get away with trying to unalive our president or members of the family or people who are speaking out. So it's really a concerning time. But what's your opinion now? Do you think the American people, or people who speak out in this political arena more publicly, are truly safe, or do we need to do a better job? Those of us who don't have Secret Service protection and detail need to do a better job when we are out at these public events. What do you think about that?
Yeah, Kyle, that's a great question. That's what we do. Our company, we train folks, Fortune 5, everybody, about how to prepare for and respond to crisis. And this is what I tell everybody I train. Congratulations, you're now your own security director. Because the bottom line is you have to own your security. The days of, hey, I'll be doing my texting and I'll just be going on with life, never thinking about what's going on around me, those are done. And what we need, what I encourage every American to do, is to begin to practice skills that allow you to see things first and hopefully stop them. In the case of the Secret Service, it's a proactive agency. They never wait, oh, we hope we can respond properly. They're always ahead of the curve. That's what was so disheartening about Butler. They didn't do the advance work that could have prevented it. Now, the good news is, a week ago with a tree stand, they did. And they stopped it before it happened. But that's every American now. We need every American to be vigilant, to pay attention. I always encourage people, when you go out into these public events, talk to your family about, hey, if we get separated, where are we going to meet? What kinds of things do you need in your car? God forbid if there's an event there that people are hurt. Are you trained to respond medically? Do you have, a tourniquet and stop the bleed capability to help, delay wounds until, rescue can get there? And listen, this is very personal for our team. One of the guys that's on the LionHeart team was a former Secret Service counter assault team guy. I mean, he is a sniper. He is a highly trained individual. But guess what? It hit him when he was in the concert in Las Vegas attending it, the Jason Aldean concert, when the sniper started firing. And, talking to him afterwards, now this is a trained person. He said, I knew what to do, but I never, ever thought that it could happen to me. And so now he's very passionate about helping Americans, prepare, because here's the fact, Kyle, we've never seen a threat picture in our nation's history like we do now. And unfortunately, many of those threats are right here among us. When you look at the cartel threat, you look at terrorism, the FBI has been saying for several years, internal cells are here. They're going to do a mass attack. Then you look at crime, and then you look at those that, are mentally unstable and looking for a cause, It's time for us as Americans to stand up and say, you know what, I'm going to be skilled in defending my freedom. I'm not going to live in fear. I'm going to live in wisdom and preparation. Yeah, I'm so glad that you're doing that. And thank you for what you're doing through LionHeart, and that you're carrying forward that great knowledge and wisdom and sharing it with people who haven't had the opportunity to have the experience and that training that you do have. So certainly people, who kind of live in more rural areas, maybe you're on a farm in Iowa, I don't know. They're probably not thinking about this. But boy, when you're in places like Portland, Chicago, Los Angeles, what we are seeing with riots and violent protests against ICE, and just the chaos, the disorder that has turned violent, this is a reality for us now, that we have to be prepared
to respond to situations that can turn violent. And we're not always sure when those are happening. And it's only been 5 short years since George Floyd's death and the unrest that we saw there that really burned Minneapolis to the ground, truly. That was unlike anything that we had seen in quite a long time, and pretty much outside of Los Angeles, if we're being really honest there. Are these worse in a way today than what we saw in 2020? Are we seeing more what we're calling peaceful, violent protests?
Yeah, I think it goes back to our discussion earlier. It's a good evil thing. Listen, all of us, I have, sacrificed a lot all around the world to protect our freedom to peacefully congregate and protest. And I totally agree with that. But when you cross the line and you begin to become part of a group that's advocating, now get this, I have some of my friends are still in Homeland Security and ICE. They're out there every day simply trying to do the job that our government gave them, and they're enforcing laws that have been voted on and supported by the people. They're simply trying to do that, and now there are contracts being put out on them, and now their families are in harm's way. Now they're physically being attacked and ambushed. Let me tell you, if the American people put up with this, it's not long before chaos will begin to take over. Because I don't know anybody that's going to strap on a gun and badge and try to go do the right thing, enforce the laws that the people of this land expect them to enforce, under the threat constantly of being murdered in their own backyards. Mm-hmm. And so I think, to your point, this is a very concerning, and I would advocate to, ask all of your young people, is this the country you want to live in? Yeah. Is this where you want to raise your kids, where the government is constantly under threat? You have folks that, because of their cause, now believe they can do anything up to and including murder. And you see the rhetoric rising. Unfortunately, social media, creates these silos of anger, I call them. But the question is, how long are Americans going to tolerate this? Mm-hmm. Because, it's not the first time we've had huge crises in the U.S. You flip back to 1859, pre the Civil War, and there were really divided people that are angry and wanted to go to war. Unfortunately, that cost several 100,000 Americans their lives, in the conflict. And so my hope and prayer, that's what I love, what you're doing. Let's have honest discourse. Let's really think about, do we want to destroy the country that is the best place on the planet? And I'll tell you, I've been on every continent. I've seen how others live throughout the world. We ought to wake up every day and say, thank you, God.
Absolutely, 1,000%. Tim, I say that all the time. We are so blessed, and we cannot we can't affix the blinders so firmly to our face and be so insulated that we don't realize how good we have it. And you are so right, my friend. It's really interesting. I appreciate that you are bringing us back to that, overarching point, that we have got to talk to each other about this so it does not go so far as to people thinking that they have to take someone else's life to make a point. Life is so precious, regardless of what side of the political aisle that you're on. And what I say to people is, as a nation, I do think we also have to look at politics in this way. And that is, we can't just put people into one of two buckets. We can't put them in either Democrat or Republican bucket or a liberal or conservative bucket. We have 336 million people in this country, right? Every single person's going to have a nuanced, complex, and different view about politics, about religion, about preferences. Everyone's upbringings are different. Our experiences are different. And we can't expect that our politics are going to fall into one of two lanes perfectly. Mm-hmm. It's just completely unrealistic. And so I think that helps to know that every person that we encounter, even if we say we're on the same side of the aisle, we're going to have those differences. And instead of fighting each other, we can appreciate those and try to be understanding and empathetic about that. I just think this divisiveness has gotten pushed so far that we're at a real breaking point. And again, keep bringing it back to Charlie Kirk's assassination. I think that shocked and shook us so much that I hope it continues to do good in the sense that we can find our way back to being more humane in understanding each other. But let's talk about the response to kind of this unrest going on in some of these cities. Now, you and I were both recently on Washington Watch. Shout out to our friends at Family Research Council. We love them.
Amen.
Yeah, they're doing tremendous work and really holding it down there in D.C. But what we were talking about in different contextual environments was, should Trump authorize National Guard to be brought into these cities that are just so out of control, Tim, that you can't put that expectation on a local police department to come clean up a mess that city and state leadership has let run out of control. Now, let's take Chicago as an example, right? You've got Mayor Brandon Johnson, who refuses to see any problem or any need for a National Guard while he spends $22.5 million a year on his personal security detail. No big deal. And then, of course, he's being backed up by J.B. Pritzker, who again, is just doing whatever he wants. And he will push back against this president at all costs. I'd love your take. I'd love everyone to hear from you on this. What do you think about the National Guard being brought into these cities just to get it back into some kind of a functioning, even with crime and unrest, functioning environment for local police to be able to handle that again?
Well, I want to say for me personally, when I entered the Marine Corps, I raised my right hand and I said, I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And, this is really not a complicated issue, because the government's number one responsibility is to protect its citizens. That's there so that we can pursue liberty and life and the pursuit of happiness. And when that breaks down and fails, you have to ask the question, why? Now, I think in many of these cities that the judges and the prosecutors have begun to reward the victim, the assailants, rather than penalize the assailants. Well, what does that mean? Well, if it's a revolving door, and unfortunately, you've seen this and you've probably reported on it, 14, 15 convicted violent felons, right back out on the street again. Well, guess what? As a police officer, our department couldn't have handled that. We put them in jail, when I was a police officer, and they stayed in jail. And so that's a fundamental issue that has to be corrected, because to your point, does the president have a responsibility to protect citizens? And oh, by the way, most of the citizens are crying out, help us. They're the victims. They don't want to live under this craziness in downtown. And so I think, to your point, the National Guard needs to be brought in. But the bigger question is, what is happening in the judicial system across our land, where judges no longer put violent felons, we can flash back to what happened to that precious Ukrainian girl on the subway. That's like, we wouldn't have believed it were it not on video. And to see her precious look on her face as her life was being taken by a convicted violent felon who, guess what, back out on the street again. So I think we need to look at both things. How do we, kind of make streets safer? I think you don't have to look too far. My career was in D.C., and there were certain areas in D.C. I was like, you got to be game on when you go to those cities. And it's very telling to me. The National Guard's been deployed. Tons of arrests, and the streets are drastically different than they were before they deployed them. So a long answer to a short question. I think the president absolutely has the authority. I think he absolutely has the responsibility and the duty to protect the American people. Now, the question is, and this can only be, answered by the elected politicians and judges, why aren't you doing that? Why aren't you executing that oath to the office that says you will support and defend the Constitution? Because last time I checked, every law that's in place was put in place by the people and executed and codified by the legislature. So, if I'm a young person, I'm going to say, well, wait a minute, my vote counts. It really counts. If I'm going to vote for this foolishness, then there's nothing that I can do or cry about when it begins to happen. And I think, I talk to a lot of folks across the spectrum, across the U.S. I'm actually very encouraged by a lot of young people, especially young families, that are coming to me after the training or talking to me afterwards and saying, hey, you know what? We get it. We've got to stand. We've got to begin to really take a stand because we've been told, shut up or you get canceled. But that's, to your point earlier, that's no longer an option.
Right.
We've got to have dialogue.
Yeah, I mean, it's reminding me of the Daniel Penny case,
Yeah.
and how sad that he went through that for just keeping people safe on the subway that day. But we need more Daniel Pennies. If Daniel Penny had been on that train with the young girl, Irina, she might be alive today.
That's right.
And we're kind of coming out of this fog in this country of seeing political leadership protect the, these criminals. And it's just wild to see. I was just in D.C. and it looks great. It looks great. We just saw National Guard members at Union Station. They look great. We felt so safe. It wasn't an intimidating experience to walk past them. We saw them on the National Mall. We were thrilled they were there. They look friendly and nice, and they're walking in groups of 2 or 3. And you just feel so much better with their presence there, being a tourist or being there for work or whatever it is that you're doing there. And so even Mayor Bowser said thank you for sending them in and taking care of this. It sorted the problem nearly immediately. I want to say within 2 weeks. So it's really putting pressure on this other leadership who's refusing to bring them in while crime and criminals are just running rampant in their city. And you make such excellent points, but I think you really cracked the code here, Tim, and that is if we don't have the judiciary backing up citizens and doing their job, this is like putting a Band-Aid on an arm that's been cut off. It's not really gonna do much. That's the systemic issue. So I'm really glad that you're breaking that down for us. You mentioned earlier about what's happening inside our borders now. The southern border particularly is completely shut down. They're seeing 0 count crossings.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like our borders are truly safe. And maybe that's given us a little bit of a false sense of security because we had millions of people, many with ill intentions toward this country and the people who live in it, flood across that border over the last 4 or 5 years. So let's talk about that. Are there sleeper cells within our borders now? Are we safe? What are they planning? And how do we deal with this?
Yeah, and unfortunately, that's something that should cause every American concern. Because let me be clear, I don't there's a colleague of mine many years ago, Sarah Adams, a CIA analyst, and she's just fantastic in her reporting. She was on Joe Rogan, and she's basically been saying, hey, look, this is what we're going to see internal Al-Qaeda cells in the U.S. begin to do. And she's specifying, a lot of targets are going to be mass strike targets. But, the thing, and I do believe that's credible information as to the danger that literally, think about this, walked across the border. I for the life of me, I can't understand how, the Secretary of Homeland Security and the leadership at the time felt like allowing 15 million people come into the United States unchecked, how that was a good idea. But I digress. The other piece, though, is it's not just Al-Qaeda. You look at ISIS is fully reconstituted again. They're angry as to what happened in Syria and across the battlefield. Now we have the IRGC. The Iranians are not out of this. Oh, by the way, now you have, we know Venezuela has inserted Tren de Agua, and you look, at the other cartel presence here, they're getting attacked. So to your point, I don't think there could be a higher internal threat level. And why does that matter? It used to be that those that wanted, to destroy our nation were screaming death to America from Tehran. They're now screaming death to America at the Capitol, pulling our flag down a couple years back. So that should tell us, whoa, wait a minute, this is a whole different situation, because it used to be that they couldn't get into the country to do these things. They're now here. And unfortunately, to your point about sleeper cells, there are entire communities of radical ideology that are supporting, hiding, and they're playing their part. What's the goal? To destroy America. And that's where we don't want to talk about it. We want to make it a political issue, a Palestine, Israel. No, these are people that are screaming death to America from American streets. And I wonder how many of your listeners would invite somebody into their home and have them scream violently at them, I'm going to kill you, I'm going to kill you, I'm going to kill you. How would that work for you? Well, welcome to modern America. We've got a serious threat. And that goes back to everybody. Every American has to be prepared. You know, there's all kinds of emergency steps we recommend with food and you know, water. But the bottom line is that's not based on fear. That's based on fact. These are different times in the U.S., and we all need to collectively, you know, come together. One of the things I encourage everybody to do, go meet your neighbors. Go talk to them. Go say, hey, you know, I don't care if there's a Trump sign or a Biden sign. Go meet them, talk to them, and say, hey, if things really started going bad, how could I help you? How could I serve you? Because you want to get to the answer, that's the answer. Americans talking to each other again.
You're so right. Isn't it fascinating that we see what's coming to the United States quite often play out in the UK first? And wow, they are having such a problem with these Middle Eastern immigrants. And you know, Tim, we're not talking about it here. We have states like Michigan and Minnesota in which these Muslim communities are just growing, and in some senses they're taking over. And we are still being held back. I think maybe there's a fear over political incorrectness still. We're not fully over that. People are asking questions about this. As these groups start to grow and kind of shame and aggress upon other U.S. citizens there who aren't of these Muslim religions and Middle Eastern countries for being American or being Christian or being white, that seems to be brewing, and we're just sort of turning a blind eye. What's going on up there?
Well, I think, you know, to your point, remember that the left has shaped the narrative as to what you can talk about. You can't say this, you can't say that. Let me tell you, everything going on, that's the most horrifying to me, because that's a blood-bought price, you know, gift that we have, and which is free speech. If we don't exercise our right to stand and speak freely, then as Americans, there really is no hope, because we're just going to get further and further apart. And to your point, you have entire communities now trying to establish Sharia law in U.S. states. And I often ask, you know, I'm periodically asked on media or whatever, you know, what are your thoughts on that? And my thoughts are, go try that in a Muslim-run country. Go in there and say, hey, we want a Christian enclave, or you know, we want a Jewish enclave, or we want a, you know, whatever. Go try that and see how that works for you. You know, the bottom line is, you know, we need to preserve the culture of the U.S. that has made us the best place to live on the planet. And if we, you know, my dad, obviously a World War II veteran, he said, you know, you only know that people value freedom when they're willing to fight for it. And the question is, you know, a lot of people ask me, so what do we do? Well, you get involved. To your point, you have discussions like we're having. You run for the school board. You support candidates that align with your values. You step into any and every area that you can stand strong for our Constitution. You know, I get a little passionate, but when I hear people bad-mouthing our country, it really infuriates me, because it's like, well, I've got a plan. You go to, and I won't name countries, I'll pay your ticket for 2 weeks for you to go there. And then you come back and tell me how horrible the U.S. is. And I think one of the things we can encourage our kids, you know, stand tall and proud as an American. We're not perfect. We have issues, systemic issues now, but we should never, ever forget that we've been blessed. You know how many people would kill to take your place? You have running water. You have the ability to dream your dream. And I think that's just such a fundamental thing that I don't know why, but it seems like we're losing it gradually. Everything becomes about what the U.S. is not, instead of a thankful heart for what we have and who we are, because we really have brought, an incredible amount of peace and freedom to the world.
Absolutely 100% correct, sir. And, when we were seeing a lot of these anti-American protests over the last year, people flying the Mexican flag or flying the Palestinian flag, and they were being interviewed, and the journalist would ask, where are you going to go? If you hate America so much, where do you want to go? And every single one, to the one, would say, well, I actually still think America is the best option, and I'm going to stay here because I still think at the end of the day, it's better than Mexico. It's better than trying to go over to the Middle East. Duh. So, hello,
right.
Stop for 2 seconds and think about what you're saying, but no one is checking these people to help them walk through their argument and understand at the end of the day that their hatred is not for this country. Their hatred has been crafted out of things that aren't actually real. And there's nowhere on God's green earth you can go that is going to come anywhere close to comparing to the beauty, the freedom, the creativity, the industry, the just kind of magic of a Christian-founded, republic. You're not going to get that anywhere. It's why our Constitution is 250 years old when the average life of a Constitution anywhere else is 17 years. And if we lose it here, we're done. We're toast. We're not going to be able to get it anywhere else. So it is worth fighting for. And we're so grateful to those who have fought and put their lives on the line. You've mentioned your current work at LionHeart, and this is so interesting. Can you walk us through, give the listeners a few things that we could be doing right now that are going to insulate us a little bit better and make us safer in our day-to-day lives?
Okay, you ready? This is really complex. Put this thing away when you're out. Your security will go up 90% if you put this away and you pay attention. We train folks, the mind is an incredible thing, and we're all created to be protectors, all of us. It's just activating those instincts and capitalizing on the way you think and see things. And we just encourage everybody, because we do, everything from events to, training individuals. And the big takeaway, and I touched on this earlier, is you are your own security director. We're seeing more and more of these active violence events where the police don't get there for 5, 6, 7, 8 minutes. That's an eternity when you're caught in a situation like that. And so, things, I know this sounds simple, but things like identifying, when you go into a restaurant, identify second and third exits. Look at those exits and say, okay, do a mental map. Do you know that for people that identify a second and third exit in a crisis, their survival goes up 90%?
My gosh.
One little thing, because guess where you tend to go in if you're not training yourself? Yeah. You go in and out the same exit, and now it's an act of violence or an explosion or whatever. You're stacked up like cordwood with everybody else, versus your ability to say, oh, there's an exit right there. Come on, let's go. The other thing is, just really thinking through. I love to challenge people. Think, what would I do if? And it's not through the lens of fear. It's through the lens of planning. What would I do if somebody came into this restaurant, tried to rob it? What would I do? Where can I sit to where I can observe who's coming in? And then, the practical skills of self-defense. I just encourage, especially young people, get some self-defense training. Understand how to protect those precious family members that rely on you, whether you're a mom or a dad or whoever. But that takes skill. And for everyone now, it used to be that we would just call 911 and the police would come and they'd take care of it. That is changing quickly. Police officers are understaffed in many locations. They're not, folks, unfortunately, young people are going, man, that's not a profession I want anything to do with. And that's concerning because you have to have integrity as a core characteristic of a police officer or, Secret Service or whoever. But the practical things, that enable you to actually do it, because, when I train, we train a lot of people. And when you ask them the question, how confident do you feel today to protect yourself or others? I would say 99% of the people we train feel not confident at all. Well, why is that? Because we're not equipping, ourselves with the practical security skills that allow us to be safe, And I would just encourage everybody that's listening, make that a priority for living in today's world. What do you do if you stumble on a protest? We're seeing people attacked in cars. Well, maybe what we do is we really do some research as to where we're going. And if you see protests, you don't want to be anywhere around that. That's just a proactive step because, to your point, these quote unquote peaceful demonstrations are becoming more and more violent. Now, thank God the police have been unleashed to do what they should do, which is when you cross the line and you begin to destroy property or attack people, you're going to jail. I'm thankful to see that, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be there for you in those seconds where you need them to be. So just proactively think about, hey, especially, home security is another thing. What would you do if someone, tried to kick your door in? Do you have a plan? Do you have measures in place? And all the things that I know sound like such common sense I'm learning, most people don't think about, and they need to think about it.
Gosh, that's so helpful. Thank you for running through those things. We should each do all of them. These phones are terrible. We think that they're bettering our lives and they're just making us miserable and apparently unsafe also. The other good thing that you know so well and that I know and people who believe in God know is that we have the Holy Spirit in us that gives us great discernment, and that sixth sense, that intuition, is a really key component here too. And sometimes we just know when something's wrong or doesn't feel right, and we need to pay attention to that.
Boy,
Tim,
is that
I gotta,
true.
Yeah, boy.
And Kyle, can I just tell you one thing? I know you're probably jumping out. I had an encounter as a police officer that showed me how real the Holy Spirit was, because I was doing a routine car stop at 2:00 in the morning, and I swear it was a voice, and it said, "Don't go up to that car." And so I went up to the car at the back passenger. I got everything that I needed, and I went back to the car. I did everything from a really tactically safe position, and let him go. And found out that those guys had just done a home invasion, and we arrested them later. And the guy in the back seat had a gun. He was waiting for us to walk up.
Wow.
So I've lived it. And I'll tell you, when you hear that voice as a believer, you might ought to pay attention to it, because it's speaking good things to you. It's never going to speak anything that's going to hurt you.
So true. Our human wisdom just falls short so completely, and yet we
right.
continue to rely on it over and over again, and then kick ourselves afterwards. Well, Tim, I'm dying to ask you, take us out on this question and answer. What was the wildest thing that you encountered or that happened to you while you were a Secret Service agent? Dying to know.
That's quite a long list. And I'm
I bet it is.
I'm trying to define wild because there were definitely wild things that happened, both from a funny and a serious point of view. But I think for me, the most bring it home to what we're responsible for. I was on the president's detail with President Clinton in 1994 when Francisco Duran actually shot 28 rounds into the White House. Wow. And so I responded out, and, thank God for the uniform division guys, the Park Police. By the time I got out there to him, he was on the ground, and I ended up taking him in custody. But I got to tell you, on the drive home, it reminded me the seriousness of the job, that we are there for one focused thing, and that's to protect the life of the president. And there were some very interesting side stories that occurred on that day, which I will not go into. But the bottom line is, at the end of the day, that reminded me the sacred mission of the Secret Service, and that I was blessed because we did have rounds coming in. I was not too far away from where the AK-47 rounds came into the White House. And so how different one day could have been. And so I would just say to your audience as well, please, when you see law enforcement, they're going through very difficult times. Please go up to them and look them in the eye and say, thank you. Thank you for what you do. Because I hear so much rhetoric about the corruption in the police department. I'll tell you, that's just not 99% of the officers I know. They are in it to do the right thing, to serve people. But they're discouraged. They're tired of being labeled as racist and, overly aggressive and all those things. So hold them accountable, but love on them. That's my take.
Well, thank you so much for saying that and wrapping this up so nicely and beautifully. And we are so thankful and grateful to anyone who serves in that capacity to protect us on a daily basis. They're the ones running in when everyone's running away, and we just can't express our gratitude enough to them and to you, Tim, for all the ways you have served and protected the American people, but up to our most precious and highest levels of leadership who we do rely on, regardless of what you believe politically. We always want to make sure that our presidents, their family, our vice presidents are well protected, and you did that so beautifully. So thank you for all of your service, military, Secret Service, Homeland Security, and otherwise. We're grateful to you.
Thank you. It's an honor to be with you, and thank you for what you're doing. You're making a difference.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. I will hope to have you on the show again in the future. And thank you all for joining us on this episode of Politically Basic, where we break down the basics of all political issues and let you decide. Be sure to follow along at politicallybasic.com and at politicallybasic on all socials so you don't miss a single episode. And we will see you next time.